You might think that this is thick, but this is thick. The Nikon F5 is a big, heavy, beautiful tank of a camera, released in 1996 when I was being bullied in school. Designed by Giugiaro, the F5 is near the pinnacle of film camera tech. And while the F6 did come later, the F5 was honestly so revolutionary that it was pretty much the basis for all future Nikon cameras. With the F4 you could see that it nearly had all the parts of this, but the F5 was what made the transition from the old shutter speed dials and brought in the dual dial controls and handling. And it was the first pro Nikon to do so. You can see this pretty easily if you've used any digital Nikon cameras, as all of the controls are pretty much the same. Even looking at the most recent pro Nikon with the Z8, the layout has not changed much in 25 years, apart from the menu getting infinitely more complicated. This is what makes the F5 a very important milestone for Nikon, as many innovations debuted in their professional line for the first time with this body. You know, just small things like support for VR lenses, full support for G lenses, and a self-diagnosing shutter, so it's always perfectly accurate, which is very important for the greatest feature, the 3D color matrix meter. And if you got a little excited at that, you're not the only one, because this meter is probably the most accurate meter ever created for a film camera. Nikon introduced matrix metering with the FA in 1983. Back then it was called automatic multi-pattern metering. And it worked by not having like a center weighted meter point that could be easily tricked. Instead it took like 5 measurements from across the scene, and using a library of known relative exposure values for each set of points, it could kind of figure out what kind of scene it was and correctly expose the film. But with the F5, Nikon took this to the next level by using a 1005 RGB segment meter that makes it even smarter by taking even more into account the color of each point, the lens focal length, the distance to the subject, which focus point was being used, the scene contrast. Everything was taken into account. And all of this work results in a meter that you can just trust, which is super important for fast moving subjects or changing situations like wildlife or sports, which is what the F5 was built for. The meter is not perfect, it's damn close, but it can be tricked in a few weird situations. For example, a dark, small subject in front of a bright sky like a bird can often cause it to underexpose a scene. So if you're pointing the camera kind of just around normally and it's saying, you know, 1/250th, and then when you point it up at the bird in a tree and it says 1/1/4000th of a second, you will need to dial in exposure compensation to handle that kind of situation. But even then, this thing still has the god tier meter, which is good for trips to the Botanical Gardens with Alex, and the 200mm f4 macro, the greatest macro lens ever made. So on to using an F5. So to turn the camera on and off, you need to press this little lock here in, and then you can switch the camera on or off. This is kind of annoying because I keep pressing this button instead to do the switch instead of the actual lock. Also, if you move the power switch further over, you can turn on and off the backlight for the LCD, which is quite handy. Next up, we have our usual Nikon controls for things like the exposure mode, where you hold down the button and then use the rear dial to change it, type of focusing mode, and then of course you've got your exposure compensation as setting as well. There's also a multi-exposure button, so you can hold that down and switch on and off multi-exposure mode. On the top of the prism, we've got our metering mode selector, so you've got things like spot, matrix, and center weighted metering. The matrix mode is only available on this and the action finder as well, while this has the 3D color matrix. We also have a diopter adjustment here, which is quite nice for people who wear glasses. And then on the back of the viewfinder, we have a little curtain that you can close to prevent light leaking in during ultra long exposures. This button here you press in and you can just slide off the viewfinder, like so. Super simple, super easy, and you can also change out the focusing screen as well. The viewfinder on the F5 is amazing, bright and clear with 100% coverage with interchangeable finder, so you can take the top off and use things like a waist level finder. The only issue with this is that the meter is in the prism, so if you take the prism off, you lose the matrix meter, and the camera then has to fall back to a basic spot meter that's built into the body. Now I think the DP30 action finder for this camera has the normal 5-segment matrix meter from the F4 built into it, so you can get matrix metering on that one, but if you want the full 3D color matrix metering, you have to use the standard viewfinder. On the left we have the rewind knob and the shooting mode selector. So it's currently set to single. There's continuous low, high, silent, and a self timer as well. I leave this on single because if you put this thing to continuous high, it will shoot 8 FPS. Kind of cool though. Also, it's kind of crazy that this camera can do 8 FPS because it's winding the film like 8 times every second. It's pretty wild. To load film, it's pretty easy. We just move this little lock here and then lift up the rewind knob, and the back just pops open. And just pop the film in and then just slip the tip into the right, lock it down, and it will advance to the first frame automatically. If you want to rewind your film, you just open the flap here, push down this button and then flip that up, and it rewinds the film. Also on the back here we have a little joystick, which is the focus point selector, which I keep accidentally hitting the whole time. I don't know if that's just a me problem, but on the F6 there's an option to lock this, which I usually keep locked because I mostly only use the center point. Also on the back here we have this little door that we can flip down, and we've got our settings for our ISO, bracketing, and a custom settings menu. So to change things like ISO, you can just hold it down and adjust it with the command dial, and then I think if you go all the way to the bottom, which goes down to ISO 6, you go to DX, and then the 6400. So it supports DX coding, but also supports manual ISOs from 6 to 6400. You also have a bracketing option, so you can tell it to auto bracket. So now it's got bracketing turned on, and you can use the front dial to change the kind of minor settings. So you can set it to 3 frames, bracket, plus, minus, negative. So then I just set to continuous high, and it'll take 3 shots. Like so, with different exposure values. So there's also a custom settings menu on the camera. So to change the custom settings, you hold down the CSM button and then you can change it by rotating the 2 dials. Now unfortunately you need a chart to decode what these numbers mean, or you could just ask Mason. The main settings menu I changed was to enable back button focusing only and to disable the shutter button focus, which is the correct way to use any camera. And yes, I will fight you on this. And then of course you've got things like, lens release. Down here we have our focus modes, so you can set to continuous, single, or manual focus. And then on the left of the camera we have our mirror lockup, so we just click that up and that holds the mirror up. And then you also have a depth of field preview. Now this camera can use any lens up to the G lenses with VR support. It can't use E lenses properly because it can't stop down the aperture, so they get stuck wide open, which on some lenses doesn't really matter. And you can't use pre-AI lenses because the AI tab can't be folded up like the F4, so And of course, because this camera has an inbuilt battery grip, we also have a second shutter button, which can be locked on and off. And you also have a second AF on button for focusing. And also the battery grip holds the space for the 8 AA batteries that are needed to power this beast. So now that we know how to use an F5 and we have it all powered up with those 8 AA batteries, it's time to go out and test it on my usual test subjects. But this time they were in the rain. But because the F5 is weather sealed, it can handle a little bit of rain. Now you might have noticed that my F5 is a bit beat up, and that was because I got it pretty cheap at €165 at Nissin Camera in Tokyo. And I was willing to buy a beat up F5 because, to be honest, I don't really need one. I already have an F6 which can do everything this can do, except, you know, pounding in fence posts. And also the F5 is such a tank that if it works, it works. Also, it's a bit less of a risk to buy a beat up body if you can actually test the camera fully before you buy it. The F5 is amazing, but it's a bit of a tank to lug around. So if you want an alternative modern film camera, you can get an F100. It doesn't have the more advanced meter of the F5, but it's a perfectly good camera and it supports all the same lenses that this does. And when I had one, I trusted the meter 100% and it worked perfectly as well. The only issue with the F100 is that the back door can break, but I have noticed that like metal repair kits have been showing up on eBay lately, so I believe you can fix that yourself now. And then of course there is the F6, which is basically a mini F5 with the inbuilt data back. And it has all of the same benefits in a smaller package, just with a much higher price tag. And also it uses CR123 batteries, which are expensive little bastards to replace compared to the F5's AA, so that can be kind of annoying. And anyway, that's the F5, a big, beautiful camera. Did come later. Actually, I'm gonna just make sure I'm recording audio here. Where's my display button? Okay, yeah, it is recording audio.